I met my girlfriend, Victoria, 7 months ago in a bar. We felt an instant connection and started dating 3 days later. She brought nothing but happiness, the perfect definition of a soulmate. So when I graduated from university, we both agreed to move in together. She's 2 years older than me and was already working, so I moved into her house. However, after moving in, everything went downhill. The first incident happened on the first night of moving in. Victoria works night shift, so she was getting ready to head out. "Babe, I'm off to work now. Just to tell you again, the neighbors next door get a little cranky at night, so just ignore them," she said sweetly. Yeah, I get it," I responded. I gave her a kiss goodbye, and she left, leaving me alone in her house. I sat down on the kitchen table and got to work. For context, I work remotely as a character designer for a video game company. It was peaceful for a few hours until the clock hit 2 a.m. The cranky neighbors began screaming profusely. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but it sounded like an intense argument. I tried ignoring it for a while, but eventually the sound became unbearable. Banging was heard on the walls, glass shattering on the floor, followed by more screaming and arguing. So much so that it sounded like multiple voices overlapping each other. I tried blasting music in my headphones, but that didn't help. Eventually, I couldn't take it anymore, so I called it a night and stopped working. The next day passed by in a flash. I chose not to tell Victoria about the neighbors since it was apparently normal, and I didn't want her to think that it bothered me so much. It was her house after all. Nighttime came and I was watching TV in the sofa when the arguments from the neighbors came again. Thumping, glass shattering, furniture being thrown around. You'd think their house is a WWE ring. Jesus Christ, I muttered to myself. Suddenly, I started hearing banging on the door, followed by a blood-curdling scream. "What the fuck?" I said while pausing the movie I was watching. The neighbor was trying to break into the house. That's it. That was the last straw. I got up and went to the back door where the banging and screaming was being heard. I grabbed a knife from the kitchen table in case the man would break the door. Thank God it was locked. Just in case, I leaned against it, each punch crushing my back. My heart was racing, my hands were shaking. I didn't know what to do. For all I knew, the man could seriously hurt me. It felt like an eternity before what I'm assuming is a man stopped banging the door. Concurrently, the screaming stopped, and it was silent. "The fuck?" I muttered under my breath. There was no way I was going to live in these conditions. I decided that I was going to confront Victoria about it when she got home. With that in mind, I made sure all the doors were locked, windows shut, and went to bed. A few hours later at 6 a.m., my girlfriend got home and laid down in the bed next to me. She hugged me from behind and gave me a kiss on the nape, waking me up. "How's everything?" she asked softly. "Were the neighbors loud?" I grunted and turned my head to face her, rubbing my eyes. "What?" Victoria giggled. "How did it go with the neighbors?" I found it strange that she asked me that today, but not yesterday. Maybe it was me being tired. "The husband tried breaking in," I said. "He banged on the door for at least 2 minutes, screaming. I thought that was the end for me. Seriously, Victoria, I don't think this house is safe for us to live in. As long as the door is locked, you should be fine." She smiled sweetly. I gave Victoria a serious look. "Listen, I can't live with these conditions." I tried to say it as nicely as possible. "I didn't even feel safe in this house last night. You're telling me this is going to happen every single night?" Victoria looked down, her eyelids drooping down in discomfort. I felt sorry blaming her for something that wasn't her fault, but we obviously needed to do something about it. "I can't fear for my life every night. I'll call the wife tonight and see if anything can be done." She hugged me tightly. "Okay?" I smiled and kissed her forehead. "Thank you, baby. I know it's not your fault." but it's impossible to live in fear in my own house every night. On the following evening, Victoria left for her night shift. Once again, I was left alone in her house. She texted me around 15 minutes later, telling me that the problem was solved and that it should be better tonight. I thanked her and laid down on the sofa to wind down. I ended up falling asleep while watching a movie. I woke up a few hours later at 4 a.m. to screaming from the psychotic neighbors once again. Furious, I got out of bed and prepared myself for confrontation. I was ready to finally get to the bottom of this. However, as I walked closer to the front door, something felt off. I noticed the voices and banging a little closer than usual, as if they were in the same house. It was the first time I ever paid attention to where the sound was truly coming from, but it was still unexpected. Subtle, but unexpected. Following the traces of sound, the screams didn't take me to the front entrance or to the house next door. They took me to the basement door, the only part of the house I haven't gone into yet. My heart began racing. This has to be my hallucinations. The sounds can't be coming from my girlfriend's basement, right? With my legs trembling, I tried to push the basement door open, but it was locked. It only resulted in even louder screams coming from downstairs. They sounded like a cry for help. "What the fuck is down there?" I muttered. The thought alone sent shivers down my spine. Thankfully, or unthankfully, my uncle taught me lockpicking when I was younger, in case I was in a dangerous situation where I needed it. Thanks, Uncle Will. So if there has ever been an opportunity to use that skill, it would be now. I took 2 paper clips and started fidgeting them inside of the lock. In just a few minutes, the door unlocked, but it still wouldn't open. I looked around the house for anything I could use until I found a crowbar. Using all my might, I pushed the door open. Looking back, I wish I hadn't. Instantly, I heard loud, blood-curdling screams piercing my ears. Screams that you would only hear in horror movies. Covering my ears, I forced my way downstairs. What I saw was horrific. Dead bodies of dozens of guys were organized in a line on the floor across the basement. Worst of all, every guy there looked to be around my age, many looking like the exes Victoria had talked about in passing. Above them was a jar. Inside it looked to be their faces, with a large glow surrounding them. They were screaming in absolute, agonizing pain. From what I saw, it looked to be their souls. The sealed, trapped souls of innocent men facing endless pain in their afterlife. The stench was unbearable. Their bodies were bled out, as if everything inside of these men were sucked out, to leave only their pure skin. Despite that, their faces were somewhat recognizable, each body neatly placed to keep its original shape. Their names were written in blood in front of each body: Jack, Noah, Michael, etc. Their screams sounded more like loud gasps from up close. The room was so loud I was getting dizzy. The screams only got louder, its sound loud enough to screech into my brain. My mind went blank, my body shaking at the thought that this was my girlfriend's creation. It got even worse when I got to the end. Another name written in blood, with no body behind it, as if it was still being prepared. Dylan. That was my name. I then got a notification on my phone, a message from Victoria. My heart stopped just by reading it. "Hey babe, OMW home. Sorry about yesterday. Let's have some fun tonight." The box had the power to bring people back from the dead, and it had made my dad very rich. "This is going to be yours one day, so you need to listen and pay attention to everything I say and do." The box was a plain maple box with no markings, but it had a smell which was hard to describe. It smelled like something from my childhood, sweet, like cotton candy or freshly made waffles. The clients were siblings who never got to be by their father's bedside when he passed. They lived overseas, and it was too late by the time they made it back. All they wanted to do was say goodbye to him one more time, and they were willing to pay a lot to do it. For the box to work, my dad would place a recent photo, the clothes the deceased were wearing when they died, and a precious personal item into the box. "We brought what you asked us to bring." They handed my father a picture of the siblings and their father, which was taken the last time they were all together before he died. They then handed him a gold watch, which they said he had since he was a young man, and never took off his hand. My dad placed the items in the box, along with what he was wearing the day he died. I wasn't sure what was going to happen next, but I could feel the beating of my heart as we stood there waiting in silence. Suddenly, a tapping sound could be heard coming from the box. It knocked 3 times before my father opened the lid. The old man looked confused at first, but when he saw the smiling faces of his kids, his eyes lit up. They spent the next 2 hours alone in a room together. I watched as my dad kept a close eye on my watch. "Why do they only get 2 hours?" I asked. "It's the rules, son," my father said abruptly. My father ushered the brother and sister of the dead man from the room. They looked devastated having to say goodbye, but at least they got to finally say it. My first experience with the dead was a strange moment for me. It was terrifying, but also kind of sweet. It was seeing the faces of the grieving families light up as they got to hug their dearly departed one more time. When it comes to the death of a child, parents would empty their bank accounts for a chance to hug their child one last time. The grief-stricken couple had traveled from the other side of the world. The pain of losing their child from a freak accident was etched into their faces. "Did you bring what I asked you to?" my dad softly asked. "This was his favorite toy. He never went anywhere without it," explained the woman. My dad placed all the items in the box before ushering the couple into another. Everyone waited with nervous apprehension. Suddenly, the smell of warm memories filled the room as the box started to shake. My dad walked over and took the lid of the box, and a fresh-faced blonde-haired boy was smiling up at us. His blue eyes were bright and radiant, and he smelled like a newborn baby. "Mommy, Daddy," beamed the young boy as his parents embraced him. My dad kept a close eye on his watch as we sat in the next room. "I hate this part," said my dad with a sullen look on his face. When we entered the room, the smell of a newborn baby was replaced by the stench of rotten meat. The boy's radiant blue eyes were now black as coal, and his face deathly pale. "We explained the rules, Mrs. Jefferson." "It's time," my dad said, as he quickly ushered the boy's crying parents from the room. My dad left me alone in the room with the boy. I watched in horror as the boy screamed in immense pain as his bones contorted and snapped. I remembered the boy's parents telling us he died from multiple fractures when a bookcase in the family home fell on him. The boy's face contorted in agony as he began to crawl unnaturally towards me. My body went stiff with fear as his hands pulled on the end of my jeans. All I wanted to do was scream, but I couldn't make a sound. Suddenly, my dad ran into the room and pulled the dead boy off me. The whole process didn't sit right with me. Watching that poor boy squirm in agony was a sight I never wanted to see again. After the parents had left, my dad picked up the boy as he cried for his parents and carried him from the room. "What are you going to do with him?" I asked. My dad stood silent as a look of guilt radiated from his eyes. "They're dead, son. Why does it matter?" As we stopped at a large steel door, my dad turned to me with a serious expression on his face. "You have to promise one thing. When I die someday, you will never bring me back." Something didn't sit right about the whole process, and I was starting to think my dad wasn't the good person I always thought him to be. A sense of dread crept up my spine as the smell of death hit me. He handed me the keys to the door as the dead boy in his arms continued to wail in agony. My hands were shaking with fear as I placed the key in the lock. I slowly opened the door, and the sound of agonizing screams was deafening. The room was filled with hundreds of moaning and wailing corpses, some calling out for their loved ones. "It doesn't feel right to just bury them," he said, as he flung the dead boy like discarded rubbish into the pile of the living dead. I remember the first time I saw it. A small orange bin with multiple warning labels, a clear lid, and what appeared to be a plastic lock that rivaled those classified as child-proof. And inside were syringes. Interesting, I thought to myself. "Hey, honey," I asked her from the bathroom to the bedroom. "Yeah," she called back. "What's this?" "What's what?" "The container full of syringes." "Oh, it's a container full of syringes." "I know that much, honey," I chuckled. "But what for?" "Are you okay?" "Oh, the fertility doctor said I need to inject myself daily with hormones to increase our chances of getting pregnant." Fair enough, I thought to myself. "Oh, okay. Just wanted to make sure." And then, we didn't talk about it. For a couple weeks. Until I continued to see it there, and began wondering how long it'd be in the house. There was just something about a container of needles that gave me the creeps. Until I asked, "Hey, honey?" "Yeah," she replied. "How long will you have to keep up the treatment?" "Treatment?" "Yeah, with the syringes." "Oh, right. Those." She paused for a moment before continuing. "It's hard to say. I have to go back and do some testing, and depending on how that turns out, I either have to keep taking it or I don't." "Got it," I replied, not wanting to pry too much. Eventually, the plastic bin filled up with syringes, and then it disappeared. Until the next day, when a brand new empty one showed up. After a while, the new one filled and disappeared, and was replaced by another, and so on, and so on. To the point where the bin became so commonplace in the house that my wife and I stopped speaking about it, and I nearly forgot about it. Until, a year later, when I saw that the bin was still in the house and inquired about it again. "Hey, honey." "Yeah?" she replied. "Not to trouble you, but I just wanted to check in on your health. I see that the syringe container's still in the house and was wondering how long you'll need to be using it." "Oh, don't worry. The doctor said my illness was getting better." "Illness?" "Yeah, the one I told you about." "You didn't tell me about an illness, you told me." But I stopped myself, curious to see what she'd say. "What illness is it?" "A perfectly non-threatening one. That needs to be treated is all." "I see. Just another few months to a year, and I'll be back to normal." And like that, she walked away. Illness, I thought to myself. But she had told me the needles were for fertility purposes. I started to grow suspicious, unsure which of her two explanations was a lie, but convinced that one of them had to be one. That's when I started to pay a little closer attention to my wife's comings and goings, and eventually noticed that every day she would go out to the shed. "Hey, honey," I asked. "Yeah," she replied. "What do you do out in the shed?" "The shed?" "Yeah, I see you going out there every day, and was just wondering what you do in there." "Oh, right. The shed. Well..." She hesitated. "I water the plants." "Plants? In the shed?" "Yeah, well, I didn't want to clutter up the house, so I've been buying them and keeping them in there." "I see. But you don't bring any water out with you?" "I keep a big bucket of water in there, so I only need to refill it every few weeks." "Got it." It seemed to make sense, but something just didn't add up. So, one day, when she went out to run errands, I snuck out to the shed to see what was inside, but it was locked. She's keeping her plants locked up, I thought to myself, trying to make sense of the situation. But I shrugged it off and went back inside. Until a few days later, when, after a few sleepless nights, I couldn't stop thinking about it. Couldn't let it go. So the next time my wife went out to run errands, I took an axe, cracked open the lock, and tossed the axe to the ground behind me. But what I didn't know was that my wife had forgotten something in the house and had come back while I was outside. And before I could open the door to the shed, I heard an ominous voice behind me. "You shouldn't have done that," my wife said, her face completely deadpan. I turned around to find her standing there. "Honey, I just wanted to see the plants." I looked down at her hands. In one was an unused syringe, cap still on. In the other was the axe. "Don't you dare open it," she commanded. "Course not," I said, holding up my hands as a display of peace. "Now go inside and never come out here again." "Of course, honey. I don't know what I was thinking." I headed back inside, my body shaking in fear as I saw her drop the axe and step inside the shed, closing the door behind her. Unable to process what had just happened and too terrified to do anything about it, I went about my day business as usual, my mind consumed by what could possibly be in the shed. I tried to sleep that night beside a woman who, for all I knew, was lying to me and capable of horrible things. But I couldn't. So when I got up in the middle of the night to go to the bathroom and saw that she was fast asleep, I snuck downstairs and went back out to the shed, this time keeping my axe in my hand. There, I found the door to the shed still unlocked, its former shackles still lying on the lawn in pieces. I opened it, stepped inside, and closed the door behind me. And what I saw was grotesque. A bulbous, heaping pile of sludge, standing as tall as the shed itself, with barbed tentacles and an uneven pair of eyes that seemed to be slowly dripping down its body. I took a step back, but before I could even reach for the shed door, a tentacle wrapped around my leg. Not knowing what else to do, I raised my axe above my head and brought its blade down onto the tentacle. The creature didn't react, but I suddenly heard my wife scream from the bedroom as if she was in pain. It's linked to my wife somehow, I realized, before looking back at the creature, seeing a few human bones below, and remembering the news of hikers disappearing in the woods behind our house over the past year. The monster started lashing out, its tentacles flailing and flailing as it attempted to grab hold of me, while its slimy body formed into a barb-filled mouth and began to move closer. I had no other option but to defend myself, so I took my axe and just started swinging at it. And each time I struck it, so too did I hear my wife screaming out in pain, her voice getting closer and closer and closer, until eventually she arrived at the shed, screaming, "Stop!" It was wounded. I was just treating it with medicine. But by the time she opened the shed door, it was too late. The creature had been hacked to pieces. And as the creature lay there, lifeless, so too did my wife, nearly unconscious from the traumatic experience. An hour or so later, she awoke, with no recollection of what had happened that night or the entire year prior, the bulbous monster having taken over both her mind and her memory. And when I tried to explain to her what had happened and told her about the excuses she had made up, including the one about fertility, she replied, "Oh no, I wasn't even seeing a fertility doctor, but I could look into it." To which I replied, "Let's just keep trying naturally. I've had enough needles for 1 year.